Okay, so we are going to talk about what your book calls psychoanalytic social psychology, which is very interesting. Because the last chapter on Adler and Harry Stack Sullivan could also have been called psychoanalytic social psychology, because those people are also, I think, even more, and to some degree, than our subjects for this chapter, Horney and Fromm. Adler and Sullivan were really, about social relationships. So there's some interesting differences between Adler and Sullivan and Horney and Fromm. And what do you think one of the main differences is? In my mind, it's a big difference. Is that Adler and Sullivan were exposed to psychoanalysis, but never became full-blown analysts. And Horney and Fromm both went through standard psychoanalytic training, both became analysts. Okay? And I think it's a little bit of an important difference. Horney and Fromm stray less from Freud's ideas, in my opinion. Okay? Freud's ideas are still very, 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 very prevalent and underpin the insights of both Horney and Fromm. And I would say that's probably more true for Horney than it was for Fromm. I think that's an important thing to know. I like both of these people. They are great examples of European immigrants. They both immigrate to the United States before World War II, which was very smart of them. I don't know if it was premonition or they just by chance. But they both get out of German speaking places, before the Nazis really start doing all the super nasty stuff, which was very, very smart of them. And they both end up in New York City, Brooklyn. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So Karen Horney, it's good to know a little about, especially we're talking about psychoanalytic people, it's good to know a little about their childhood. As you can again trace some of her ideas to her childhood experiences. She grew up in a home with a distant father and a nice mother, and she was very attached to her mother because her father was very distant. The father favored the older brother. The father was not affectionate. I think he was a sea captain or something. He was gone for a long time. And around the age of 9 or 10 or so, she started to become more rebellious. And at the age of 12, supposedly, she decided that she'd had an experience with a family doctor and decided that she was going to go into medicine. And her parents, especially her father, did not want her to go to university. That was not an uncommon attitude at the time for women. That the job for women was to grow up and meet a husband and have babies, and not to have a career. That was very typical. But she went to college anyway, went to university anyway, studied medicine, and went around Germany and studied in different places, different universities, like 4 or 5 universities. That is something that seems very odd to us, because I think most of you guys, didn't come to Channel Islands and then, spend a year at Cal State LA, and then spend a semester at San Luis Obispo, and then, maybe a year at Sonoma State, and then, San Francisco State, and then come back to Channel Islands and finish, right? Most of you don't do that. Our system is not set up to make that. I suppose you could do it. It'd probably be very difficult. It'd be very interesting. Probably very difficult. But our system is not set up for that. But back in the time in Germany, about the turn of the century in the early 1900s, that was actually fairly typical for students. And if you read about a lot of these people who were educated in Germany, especially at that time, that was a typical pattern. You would typically go to 4 or 5 universities before you got your degree. And it was very easy to go from one to the other and transfer and bring your credits along with you. That was really pretty typical. And you also have to remember, we're talking about these people who went to these German universities. German education was Germany at that time was the preeminent educational system in the world. That if you wanted to have a degree that meant something, you would, especially a doctoral degree, you would go and get your degree in Germany. That was, and Germany was in the forefront of all sorts of, biomedical, chemical, physical science breakthroughs. A lot of the drugs that we still use nowadays were invented in Germany, at this time. Aspirin. You guys may have taken an aspirin before. That was, originally came from willow bark, but it was synthesized by German chemists. The company Bayer, which you may have heard of, Bayer aspirin, still around. And then other things, heroin, a few other things, amphetamines, some things that seem to plague us now. But they were the preeminent educational system in the world. And so I'm going on this detour to explain why it is that two relatively obscure physicians in Germany could come to the United States and be offered pretty good jobs, assistantship jobs. Because coming from Germany was, if a university got somebody with a German degree, it was very prestigious. And so you got somebody who came from Germany, German degree, that they go to the top of the list, the short list, right, for hiring. She is also, again, we want to know why she becomes sort of a feminist later on. Well, she is, experiences directly the challenges of having a career and a family. She marries a businessman, Oscar Horney, who contracts pretty serious illness, meningitis, I think in the 20s, and maybe has some personality changes for that. They have a bunch of kids. And Karen Horney is working as a physician. This puts a strain on their relationship. They end up divorcing, and she packs up the kids and comes to the United States in 1932, and gets out before the Nazis really get into power. She practices as she's trained in the Freudian Institute. Her training analysts, were two of the people who were in Freud's close inner circle. So Karen Horney was actually part of that close inner circle of Freud and his first followers, and she was kind of the second generation of followers. But she knew Freud, and she interacted with Freud. Freud really became more and more cooler toward her as her own individual ideas sort of evolved. Freud distanced himself from her. Okay, Freud did not like his followers changing his stuff. Very, very clear. He came up with the original things. The job of his followers was to maintain his ideas, not to change them. And he did not like that. And so he became more distant from Horney, but she knew him. And you can go, and I went to a museum exhibit once on Freud, and they had some stuff from the Wednesday night group where people signed in, the sign-in sheet, and her name was there, and you could see her name, Karen Horney, signed in. She signed in for the group, and so she was there with all these guys, and she was analyzed by two of Freud's closest disciples, Sachs and Ferenczi, I think it was, who were very interesting too, people. She comes to the United States. Finally, she kind of, she decides to come to the United States. She works at the New York, Psychoanalytic Institute, and teaches there, and teaches in medical school, and has a career here, and sees patients, and starts writing her own stuff, and starts veering off a bit from Freud, and this eventually causes friction with the other psychoanalysts, and eventually she resigns. I don't know, she's kicked out or resigns from the Psychoanalytic Institute in New York, and goes off on her own. She's still teaching in a medical school, she's still doing stuff, and eventually what happens is she develops her own institute and her own journal. I think the American Journal of Psychoanalysis, I think, was founded by her. Looking back on her, at the time she was seen to, kind of go heretic and, go rogue, and she's broken off from the psychoanalytic orthodoxy. If you look back on her stuff now from perspective of 2018, it doesn't seem like she's that unorthodox. She's still, in my opinion, still within the Freudian fold, neo-Freudian fold. But most modern Freudians are neo-Freudian, so she doesn't seem that off. And some of her ideas, like womb envy, which we're going to talk about, really now seem, I think there's more what you might call orthodox analysts who might accept those kind of ideas, especially feminist psychoanalysts. And there's a number of very good feminist psychoanalysts out there now, and they've expanded on our ideas, and I think in some ways brought those more into the orthodoxy. She writes a book, something about neurosis for our times. This becomes a very popular book. Her writings are very accessible. They're very readable. She's very readable. Her books are very, about the article, but the books are very readable. They appeal to a mass audience, and so she gets some traction from that. Okay, it's also her Freudian colleagues or other Orthodox Freudian colleagues don't like so much. I'm a little jealous. And she goes on to write quite a bit and has this interesting career. I think she dies, as the book says, she dies in the 50s, maybe? Does your book say about that? She dies somewhere in the 50s. Oops, spilled my coffee. You know what's going to happen this semester. 1952, she dies. Okay, so that's about her. So let's talk a little bit more about, come on. She really, the heart of her theory, she really is interested in anxiety. Okay? Now, I'll ask you, where did you see this idea before? Who talked a lot about anxiety? Freud. Anxiety was at the core of Freud's theory. So in this sense, Horney does not deviate from Freud, except that her emphasis in anxiety is not on anxiety generated internally from repressed stuff, from the repressing stuff from the unconscious that causes the anxiety. The anxiety comes, from Horney's view, from stuff in the environment, from other people. Okay? And that becomes more of a driving force for her rather than the stuff trying to come up from the unconscious. And she talks about this basic anxiety, which is a pervading feeling of being lonely and helpless in a hostile world. And again, if you think about her upbringing as a child and these kind of, her father very distant and her mother and father quarreling a lot, something she writes about, you get the idea. You imagine what it's like being a little child and your parents are arguing and you feel and you're being sort of left alone and abandoned, and so this creates anxiety. Right? You can see this from her childhood. I like this idea very much because this idea is also very, very in concert with existentialism that we're going to talk about later on. And I reading her and reading Fromm, I just wonder if they were influenced directly by existentialists, because there's a lot of existential stuff going on, in Europe, and but mostly in philosophy. And so I wonder about this because these are really existential insights. This anxiety about feeling being lonely and helpless in the hostile world. And Fromm even elaborates on this a little bit more. Okay? So this becomes one of the main driving forces for humans. And then she talks about, related to this, basic evil, what she calls basic evil. And these are negative factors that provoke insecurity. So if you're a child and your parents ignore you, or your parents physically abuse you or abuse you in some other way, or are inconsistent with you, these are all things that she would consider basic evil. These negative factors would include things like this. Now, Horney comes up with this idea of neurotic needs or trends, and again, you can think here of Freud's defense mechanisms. So again, the influence from Freud is really, really strong here. So these defense mechanisms, defensive attitudes, and these become exaggerated or inappropriate at times. And again, we all have these defense mechanisms. We're all able to use these things, but a healthy person will have a balance, will use these things in the appropriate situation. Okay? An unhealthy person will sort of focus on one and use one in all situations. In other words, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail even if it's not, right? And that's an unhealthy neurotic person. Okay? And she had 3 types of coping strategies or primary modes of relating, and again, you can think of these like defense mechanisms, or at least things that influence defenses. She had moving toward, which was an attitude of compliance, moving against, which was an attitude of hostility, and moving away, which is an attitude of detachment. All these things you can probably think in your life when you've done all these things, and most of us use these things like multiple times, in any given day. But if you use one to deal with everything, then that's problematic. Like if I, and this is my tendency here, I self-disclose, I'm very introverted, so my main thing is I will probably use moving away, detachment, in most of my dealings with people. If dealing with somebody makes me anxious, my main thing to do is just, leave, get away, right? Conflict avoidant, right? Or somebody else might get mad, and somebody else might just knuckle under to whatever the person wanted, okay? So these are the 3 things for Horney, very important. Now, these coping strategies, these things lead to 3 basic orientation toward life. A self-effacing solution, this appeal to be loved. A self-expansive solution, appeal at mastery. And a resignation solution, desire to be free of others. And these kind of parallel these things here. Okay? So self-effacing, appeal to be loved. Somebody makes demands on you, you get anxious, and so you just try to comply with the person, give them what they want, get them to like you, get them to love you, and just sort of knuckle under, be submissive. Okay? Self-expansive solution, you would attempt to master, control other people. Okay? You might try to put other people under your control. This, I think, in my mind, this requires a little bit of hostility. Okay? And then resignation is just you just resign yourself to the situation. It's not going to get any better. The only thing I can do is get away from it. That makes sense? And here you can see, and this is a pretty good table here, you can see examples of this. So here's the neurotic trend, here's the primary mode of relating to others, and here's the basic orientation toward life. Okay. So neurotic trend might be an exaggerated need for affection and approval, and the primary mode of relating to others would be moving towards compliance, accepting one's helplessness and becoming compliant. And a basic orientation to life would be self-effacing, this appeal to be loved. Okay? Neurotic trend might be a need for a dominant partner. Okay? Or an exaggerated need for power. It can be one or the other, right? So this is kind of a little confusing for her because you could have a need to be submissive, or you could have a need to be dominant. So in the Freudian sense, this is sadomasochism. We call them, standard Freudians are called the sadomasochistic position. And they're related to one another. So this is why these seemingly opposite things can also engender the same sort of thing here. And so the idea here, need for dominant partner, exaggerated need for power, moving against, hostility, rebelling, resisting others to protect oneself from a threatening environment. And this could be a self-expansive solution, striving for mastery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can see the other ones down here. Need to exploit others, exaggerated need for social recognition or prestige, exaggerated need for personal admiration, exaggerated ambition for personal achievement. So these are these neurotic trends here, and I think there are more of these, a couple more. She had 10 of these neurotic trends. Need to restrict one's life with narrow boundaries, and this would be an example of moving away, detachment, isolating oneself to avoid it with others, and the resignation solution, desire to be free of others. Exaggerated need for self-sufficiency and independence, and need for perfection and unassailability. So these 3 would be moving away. These 2 would be moving towards, and these 5 would be moving against. Okay, that makes sense? And this came from, she wrote a book on self-analysis. By the way, Horney was very interested in self-analysis. And she thought people could perform a self-analysis, kind of modified form, I believe it was a modified form of free association that you do yourself, and that you could come to some of these conclusions. She didn't feel like it was a replacement or as good as psychoanalysis, with another person, but she thought if it's better than nothing, basically. So she wrote this whole book about self-analysis, which is very interesting. So this is the primary way when she's working with patients, that she's understanding the patient's conflicts. So she's first looking to see, what neurotic trends does the patient tend to have? What are they? They're telling me about their life. They're telling me what they're doing. They're reporting behaviors and dreams, and they're free associating. And the idea is the therapist would get a sense of which one of these is sort of, most extant. And then from knowing these, then she would know this is the primary mode of relating to others. And then what's going to happen is she's going to start seeing this happening in the transference with the patient. And then you can interpret that transference to the patient. Oh, I see you sound like you're moving against me. You sound like you need to rebel against me. And I keep pointing that out till the person becomes aware of it, right? And so this is how she would be doing psychoanalysis with people, okay? Using these ideas. Rather than, just saying what's the primary person's defense mechanism. Okay? So one way to look at this is actually a very nice, in my opinion, extension of Freud's ideas, making it in a way that is very workable in a clinical setting, in my opinion. Okay, she also talked about the idealized self, and this is just really a riff on Freud's idea about superego. Because I think we mentioned this before, Freud, you guys know the superego is our mostly unconscious, internalized sense of what's right and wrong. And also the superego contains something called the ego ideal, which is the ideal situation that we can see ourselves, our ideal self that we strive toward, if we're healthy, that we strive toward. Okay? Horney recast this more in a social way, and she talks about the ideal self represents what we are, those things that are true about us. So we have a real self and an idealized self. So the real self is what we are, the things that are true about us. This is, another way to think of this is our authentic self, okay? It's who we really are. And our ideal self is what we think we should be. And we use this as a model to assist us in developing our potential and achieving self-actualization. Okay? So this is very, very important. So the real self and the idealized self. So most of you guys, you're college students, most of you have probably, hopefully, a sense of who you are now in the world. But you also have a sense of who you're going to be, right? So you're in college. I assume that, unlike me, you're not going to stay in college forever. You're going to go on and do something else with your life. And, what do you see yourself doing in 5 years? What do you see yourself doing in 10 years? What kind of person are you going to be? What is your style of life? How are you going to be living? What are you going to be doing for work? What kind of relationships are you going to have with other people? What do you see yourself? What is your ideal situation for yourself? And notice I'm defining it in terms of situation, and defining it in terms of the environment and social relationships, not defining it in terms of what's going on in your own unconscious, as Freud would do. But she's really looking at it as something, as a social thing. Okay? How do other people see you? Helps define who you are. And so again, you can all get a sense of your real self, who you are now, and your idealized self, right? And just think about when you were in college. Now, to me, this is very similar to Jung's idea of the persona. I doubt Horney was influenced by Jung, but I think it's getting at the very same idea, the archetype, the persona. Very similar here, right? And just like Jung's persona, the closer the idealized self is to the real self. And for Jung, the closer the persona is to the person's everyday personality. The more those are in congruence with one another, the more more healthy the person is. And so the more your real self is like your idealized self, the healthier you are. When the idealized self and the real self are far apart, then you get some problems. And you get problems of, first of all, alienation. That you're alienated. You're alienated from yourself. I'm never going to be that idealized self. I'm never going to be it. It'll never happen. My idealized self is I'm going to become President of the United States. But that's not going to happen. It's very unrealistic for me. Right? So my real self is really removed from my ideal. And that leads to alienation. And again, harks back to the other things, basic anxiety, loneliness, all those kind of things, harks back to that. Okay? And the second thing when they're far apart is you can have the tyranny of the should. Very catchy phrase and a way of expressing Freud's idea of an overactive superego. And Freud talked a lot, because Freudians talk a lot about this. People have overactive superegos that are saying, you should be doing this, you're not good, you're bad, you should be doing this. That inner voice speaking to you all the time, driving you. And again, if you see people who are schizophrenic or whatever, sometimes that inner voice actually really becomes a real hallucinated voice, and it can become very persecutory. That's an extreme example. But for us, it's like, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm never good enough. I'm not doing what I should be doing. Those kind of things. I'm sure we can all, at some point in our life, relate to that. Okay? And so Horney calls this the tyranny of the should. Okay? And again, it's when this idealized self is very removed from the real self. Anybody ever experienced the tyranny of the should? And again, if you have parents who are overly authoritarian, overly demanding, as a child, a young child, when you grow up, you may have an overactive superego, and then you can have this sort of thing. Now, from Freud's point of view, that's coming from the unconscious. You've internalized those parental figures that are demanding of you, and so that's where it's coming from. For Horney, it's a little bit more about whatever the social situation is. Not that she would completely let go of that Freudian stuff, but the social situation is also involved in it. So the tyranny of the should. Okay, the tyranny of the should. And again, in our culture, you might see this more with authoritarian parenting. I think we'll talk about parenting in a minute. That makes sense? Anybody have an experience of this they want to share? Tyranny of the should? I can think of lots of things in my life. I should do this, I should do that. I should have a career where I can actually make money. I should do this kind of thing. I should recycle the garbage. I should drive, an electric car, not a big gas guzzling monster. Should. And sometimes this echoes with our politicians. That we feel like the politicians will kind of tell us, all right. And if you have an overblown superego, this can sometimes be problematic for you. Then you become a libertarian, you say, no way, I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I don't have to listen to somebody tell me what to do, right? So again, you can look at this, and again, this is this diagram here, and you can see these kind of things. It puts it in a very nice way here. That the neurotic person, they're removed from each other. The real self is here. Now, we're always striving toward the idealized self, and I don't think any of us ever actually get to it completely, right? And different cultures deal with this differently. In some cultures, the tyranny of the should is a little bit more accepted. And I wish Dr. Baker was here because there's a little bit on this chapter about parenting, that Fromm did not come up with this stuff, but she inspired the people who came up with, like Diane Rimbaum and other people, Baumrind, who came up with the parenting styles. So she inspired them. But you can see that those ideas are very consonant with these kinds of things. How you raise your kids to be normal and not be stuck in one of these areas. But there are big cultural differences. Okay, big cultural differences. This make sense? All right, so you can go through this thing. It's in your book. This is kind of cool. I was doing this last night. Neurotic needs, modes, and orientation. You can go through these things and you can think, okay, what's going on here? Okay, in these things. So we could try one here. Maria prevents her partner, Kristen, to control her and dictate her activities. Okay? So if we go back here, which one do you think she is here? Letting her partner control and dictate her activities.
Yeah, compliance.
Compliance, right? She'd be moving towards, okay? And maybe she has you see her clinically, you see she has an exaggerated need for affection and approval, and a need for a dominant partner. You're going to go, oh yeah, this fits her. So she's moving towards, and these are appeal to be loved, okay? And what you might do is, if you're doing therapy with her, see, try to see, like, where are there situations where this is not appropriate, but it would be more appropriate to move against or to get away from whatever the situation is, and see if you can engage her to start using some of these other modes of relating to others. Okay? Like maybe maybe your partner is telling her what to do all the time, and kind of domineering, and that's making her miserable. And maybe she needs to be assertive. Back in the 60s, we called this assertiveness training. Maybe she needs to be assertive. But for Horney, it would be using the moving against mode. Maybe rebelling, maybe standing up for herself. Right? And so the idea is you start exploring these kinds of things, the other things in therapy. The idea that she could use all these modes, not just one. Okay? And again, you can do the exercise here. You can go through these and, I like this name, Lael, prides herself on being totally autonomous and self-sufficient. So she's obviously in the, the moving away, right? Trying to get away from people. Okay. Here's an interesting one. Gianna is forever singing her own praises. Sounds like narcissism. So what would Horney say about narcissism?
Probably hostility, right?
That would be what I would think. Yeah, I would think hostility. But also could be, in a way, it can also be this is where it gets a little interesting. It also could be a way of, you want to, maybe you're not accepting others, you're not maybe the helpless one, but you're helpless in the sense that you need other people to give you admiration. So narcissism can get a little confusing there. But yes, a little hostility, controlling people, that could be part of it. So again, you would explore these kinds of things. That makes sense? Now, let me ask you guys a question, so we have this slide up. How many of you think that there could be more than 3 of these things? Yeah? What would be another one? Just make up one, off the top of your head.
If she's singing.
Won't be in the book.
Oh.
Just Horney said there are these 3 modes of relating. But these are only 3 modes. Could there be other modes of relating to people? It's an interesting question. Yeah.
I don't know any, I can't really think of any other ones, but it's interesting how it kind of relates to the whole fight, flight, and appease modes.
Yeah. And, that's very interesting because there's actually been a lot of research done on that. And and again, that's something I'll talk about in the 473 class. Appeasement is something that primates use when confronted by a hostile situation. Appeasement is very common. And in the 473 class, I have a whole lecture on Stockholm Syndrome. And so this is one of the things, you fall in love with the person who kidnaps you or is holding you for ransom. And this is I'll give you really intense examples of that in the other class. But this is a known thing that happens. It's pretty easy. Happens, and again, this would fit right in with Horney's stuff pretty well. And again, you can think of a biological evolutionary underpinning to these things. Which modes of relating here had the most survival value in our primate past? Okay, and again, there may be more than just these 3. Yeah.
What about adding fear to the list? Like, some people always see every situation as a threat or fear.
That would be the basic anxiety for Horney.
Okay.
Now, when we get to Fromm, you'll see the basic anxiety is just not just loneliness and separation, but also that is elaborated in fear of death. And that, of course, is a very existential idea. Existentialist talk, that's the whole thing about existential psychology, is you're motivated by fear of death. And we could have, we'll have a long talk about that, because it's very interesting. But yes, the fear is fear and anxiety are, the distinction between them is, you're fearful of something. There's something causing you to be afraid. That's where anxiety can just be free-floating. You can just be anxious and not really realize where it's coming from. Or you can be anxious about something. But fear is, there's generally a specific target for fear. That's an important thing to know about. Okay. Now, Horney is very famous for feminine psychology, feminine psychoanalysis, I might call it. Feminist psychoanalysis. She's the progenitor of the feminist psychoanalyst movement. And by the way, there are a lot of feminist psychoanalysts, and feminist psychoanalysis has, in my opinion, entered into the mainstream of psychoanalysis now. And some of the top psychoanalysts in the world are women who identify themselves as feminists. So just so that you know, because Freud gets a bad rap, a lot of times students will come to me and they say, oh, I don't like that Freudian stuff. He's really super misogynist against women, and it's got all these stupid ideas like penis envy, and it's just dumb, and it's just putting women in their place, and I don't like it, and I'm going to go and study Jungian psychology, because Jung was this old man, he was wise, and he was so nice to women, and and really the truth is that Jung was sort of the misogynistic womanizer, and Freud was actually a product of his times, but started a system of psychology which has been embraced by feminists and which has been expanded by feminists to include other ideas, and the views of women have been updated. Okay, so we're not looking at women in psychoanalysis as if we were living in 1880 anymore, and during Victorian times, where women were repressed, and especially women's sexual drives were considered to be something never to be spoken of or talked about, and were societally repressed. And again, take my 473 class, I'm going to talk all about that in that class, and you will learn something shocking that I'm almost sure that most of you do not know about. But this is where psychoanalysis comes from. It does not stay that way. Okay, and you have wonderful feminist psychoanalysts really revising Freud's theory, taking a look, adding things, and Karen Horney is the progenitor of this. Okay, she really is the first one who says, yeah, I think you old men don't really understand what's going on with women, and I'm gonna set you straight. And this is one of the things, by the way, that caused Freud to go, yeah, okay, I'm kind of cooling off towards you. I think Freud missed out on this. Okay? So she develops a theory that focuses on women's experience. She comes up with this idea of womb envy. This is the opposite of penis envy, right? We talked about penis envy, the idea that the little girl believes herself, in the old school Freudian view, believes herself that she had a penis, but it was taken away. Okay? And so now she must replace it with something, and she ends up going this sort of called Electra complex, Oedipal complex, realizing that if she identifies with mommy, and she can then have the baby with daddy, and then she wants to then have a baby with daddy to replace the missing penis, but she can't do that. So what she ends up doing is identifying with mommy, because mommy's the one who has babies, and then she resolves it that way. Okay, that's the old school Freudian thing. Horney says, okay, maybe that's true for girls. What about boys? What about boys? Maybe they have womb envy. And what's womb envy? Womb envy is when the young boy realizes that he does not have the power to procreate. In other words, mom can give birth to babies. Mom can produce life. But dad can't, and boys can't do that. And this creates in the little boy an experience of intense envy. Intense envy. And this intense envy gets repressed, as everything in Freudian psychology gets repressed. But it comes out in ways for men, in basically two sorts of ways. The first way, which is the most unfortunate one, is that it comes out in that men belittle women. They become misogynist, they put women down, they denigrate women, they turn them into second-class citizens, they don't take care of their, they pay them less, that's still the case, right? Women are still making 80 cents on the dollar, compared to guys. They pay them less. They pass restrictive laws restricting the behavior of women. Was it in Saudi Arabia, women just got the right to get a license and drive. It just happened a couple months ago. For Horney, this is all due to womb envy. Okay? So all these things that these men, because they're so pissed off, because they're so envious, that they can't do the one thing that women can do that they can't, which is to create life. Okay? And again, if you're Freudian, this is all gets repressed, and then it comes out in all these in these societal and cultural ways where women are made to feel lower than men, okay? treated worse than men. The other way that Horney says it comes out is that men, in order to compensate for this lack of being able to bring a new life into the world, invest tremendous energy in creative fields as a compensation. Okay, they can't have kids, so they put that energy, they sublimate it, they put it into some incredible creative contribution in science or art or whatever it might be. Okay? And so this is the thing that maybe you might want to consider the good thing about it, that a healthy man can take that need for creativity and sublimate it into something else. They can never have a child. Okay? Now, if you read the National Enquirer, you will see that there are men who have babies every once in a while, but most men do not have babies. Okay? There was a case where the man was a trans man, still had all his woman parts, and he was able to have a baby. That's rare. That's not what Horney's talking about. Okay, you might say that guy's got the best of both worlds. I don't know, but this womb envy thing is something you see all the time, and so I'm very interested in this idea of womb envy, and I've started to pay attention to this. And if I were seeing patients, I think I would be seeing this all the time now. I pay attention to this when I watch interactions with men and women. And I'm really starting to believe this is really a thing. I really think this is out there. Anybody else, any of you women have a sense of this, that this may be something that's true? The womb envy, that the guys in your life, men in your life. Pretty unconscious. I mean, how many women here have ever experienced guys putting them down? You can all raise your hand, because this is probably true of all of you at some point, right? And did you ever have a sense that behind that was the idea that guys felt like that they weren't able to really, truly be creative in the sense of procreation? It's pretty unconscious. It's pretty buried down in there. Okay? Pretty buried down in there. Any of you guys, you ever felt like, you ever get in touch with this? You ever felt like that, that, wow, I can't have a baby, I can't do that act of having a child, creating a child in my body? It's pretty unconscious. Probably most of you are really happy you don't have to go through childbirth. Especially if you've ever seen it or experienced it, you'll be probably pretty happy. You'll also realize that women are a hell of a lot tougher than guys. I don't care, you can pick your biggest MMA fighter dude, all muscled out. If he had to give birth to a child, he would be a screaming, pile of, jello, right? It's a very intense experience. Men are just totally not tough enough for it. Right? Women are really tough. And when you see childbirth, you'll realize that. And I encourage you guys all to, if you get a chance to watch a childbirth. And then come back and tell me what you think about this. Be curious about it. But I think, my personal feeling is I think womb envy is something deeply repressed in most men. And I think that, it's not close to the surface. Not like the persona that we talked about that you can, oh yeah, I kind of get that. It's like, oh yeah, it's really far down there, right? But I can know in my own life, I think I became more aware of it, when my child was born and going through that process. That made me maybe a little more aware of it. I'd be curious about that. That'd be a very good doctoral dissertation to do, to go and survey men and see if you find these attitudes in men. I don't know if anybody's ever done that. Yeah, Monica?
I could see like, maybe the jealousy like come out, like once a woman like has their baby and like the men like, maybe sees the closeness that she has with her baby because.
Yes.
Like, I can see it then maybe.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, very good comment. Yeah.
Isn't that why they're trying to make men have a paternity leave?
Yeah.
Also now because
Yeah.
I think that could be because they feel that they should also be there
Yeah.
for their
Yeah.
baby when it's born.
Yeah. And it's probably good for the baby because having a baby it's a tremendous amount of work, especially the first couple months. Nobody's sleeping, and so if, the dad's out of work all day and the mom's there, that's really tough on her. Just the fact that you need, especially with very small infants, you need help. Traditional societies, what do you do in a traditional society?
The mom stays home.
Mom stays home, who else is there?
Grandma's
there. Yeah, grandma's there.
Grandma's sisters, cousins.
Grandma's sisters, cousins, everybody, extended family comes to support the new parents. And again, we've lost that in America. Doesn't happen as much here, right? Our society, we're all kind of alienated, according to Horney and Fromm, we're all alienated, and we've lost that, and that makes us crazy, and makes us not as good parents, and we end up having kids who have more trouble.
Well, a lot of women also fall into postpartum depression,
Yes,
and
Yes.
they become very resentful.
yes, postpartum depression could be something, it could be related to this. You're doing all this work with this kid, and now maybe you're unconsciously picking up from the husband that he's kind of denigrating you a little bit. Sure, it could be. Great doctoral dissertation, by the way. That would be very good. So I'm going to give you're all going to have 3 or 4 doctoral dissertation ideas apiece by the end of this class. So, because I'm expecting you all to go on and get your doctorate. So, just so you know that up front, I'm thinking you're all going to go get your doctorate. So I'm going to give you all dissertation ideas. Yes, Alicia.
In Europe they actually do that.
Yes.
Because I'm from Denmark, Copenhagen, that's where I was born.
Yeah. European countries, especially Scandinavian countries,
They-
much better at this stuff, and they have much less rates of problems with their children as they get older. They have other problems, but they don't have problems related. They're really good about social support
and they
things.
pay parents, the government pays parents for 12 years after the child is born.
Yeah.
I think 1,500 to
Yeah.
every month for their expenses, and even men, they go on maternity leave.
Also, college education is free, and so is
Yeah,
medical
oh my
care.
God.
So that's a socialized country. So when you hear people putting down socialism, those are socialized, socialized capitalism. Capitalist countries with a socialized system. We don't have that here. You guys know this from firsthand experience. I'm not going to be political about this, but from firsthand experience about just even getting medical care. It's been a huge debate in our country. Every other developed country, this is not even, nobody even thinks about it. They have nationalized free health care for everybody. Nobody even thinks about this. America's one of the few examples of this. Right? Take that with you will. So women would be very important. I like this idea. I think this is a really important idea. I think psychologists should be more aware of this. And I had an interesting case I saw a woman in therapy as part of group therapy, and I worked with her with another therapist, and the other therapist saw the woman's husband. And as this woman became more, in her own therapy, became more confident in herself and more seeing herself in the role as the mother and the person having the children in the family and nurturing the children, the husband decompensated more. He started to go see prostitutes. He started to snort crack. Started to do all these. And he's a middle class guy with a very 6-figure job. He's not like some guy living in the ghetto. He's a professional guy. He started decompensating, and this idea always stuck in the back of my head that he was experiencing wound envy, and he was doing all these sort of things not because they were filling a need of his, but in order to sort of get at her, get back at her, make her feel bad. And I always thought about that. I always thought about this idea of womb envy. I thought that may have really been, I don't know, it would have been a really interesting case to write up. I'm kind of sorry we never wrote it up. It was very interesting. It's kind of an idea. So I think there may be other male behaviors that may relate to this that really we haven't really tapped into yet, we haven't really looked at yet. So again, another aspect that you could do some research on this. So if somebody wanted to do an interesting 301 project, you can create a survey and see if you can get at male womb envy. It'd be an interesting project. I'd be very curious to see that. Okay, so assessment and research in Horney's theory. This is not a scientifically studied thing like all the clinicians, most of the clinicians, the early ones that we're going to talk about. They really come to their these sort of insights about human personality through clinical work. In Horney's case, this would be doing free association and doing dream work, typical psychoanalytic stuff. This is what's supporting the theory. Okay? And she talked about the systemic self-analysis. But Horney's work, while her stuff was not scientific, it really it stimulated research in a couple of very, very important areas. We talked about psychology of women. There's been some stuff about hyper-competitiveness, which is interesting. But the two things that are maybe the most popular are attachment theory and parenting styles. Now, Horney is not the great-grandmother of attachment theory, but we can think of her as kind of the great aunt of attachment theory. Attachment theory, very important. I don't know in this class if we're going to have a chapter where we deal with attachment theory. It should come up in the object relations chapter, which we're going to get to soon. But attachment theory is this idea that very early on in the child's life, that the attachment to the parents, and specifically the parent providing the mothering, really sets the stage for how that person relates to other people later on in their life. And so attachment theorists talk a lot about like insecure attachment. When the early childhood, the parent has bonds with the parent, but it's very inconsistent and insecure. When that kid grows up, they behave in certain ways where they're insecure and they don't trust other people and all sorts of stuff. And then there's other kinds of attachment as well. And you guys will learn about these in other classes, so I'm not going to go too much into it now. And then the other thing is parenting styles. This is Diana Baumrin's stuff about parenting styles. And you have 4 parenting styles. Have you guys heard this before? Those of you taking developmental psychology, you're going to get this. Parenting style, and then we have a parenting class here too, by the way. It's taught by Dr. Moon, who's an excellent teacher, an excellent clinical psychologist. And she has a whole parenting class, which if you're thinking of having kids, I highly recommend you take it. And they talk about parenting styles. So the parenting styles are, let me get this up, I can't remember the names. The parenting styles are authoritarian, authoritative, non-involved, and indulgent. I don't know what they call it.
Passive, indulgent, passive,
indulgent.
permissive or something.
Permissive parenting, yeah. So if you talk to Dr. Baker, he will tell you that permissive parenting is the worst. I don't agree with that. But in our culture, the bad ones, the ones that seem to lead to problems with kids, are everything but authoritative. So permissive parenting, authoritarian parenting, and non-involvement. Okay, non-involvement is the kid just basically raises himself, and non-involved parents, the kids can actually end up growing up being very self-sufficient, but then they get other problems, right? Authoritarian parents are ones that keep a tight rein over the kids. They learn to be obedient to authority. If they're not, then they get in trouble, and you'll see this in a lot of super religious families. Authoritarian parents a lot of times beat their kids. You'll see some of these parenting books written by some of these fundamentalist guys, and they advocate beating the kids. There's actually been some deaths because some of these people took those things very literally and beat their kids to death. There's some actual interesting, very, very sad court cases that came in the media about some of these things. And if you take my Nazi Germany class, Dr. Baker will come in and talk about this. Actually, very interesting. Because in his mind, how do you get people to follow the Nazis? Well, you have a lot of authoritarian parenting in the generation previous to the rise of Nazi power. And so people are sort of primed to follow, authoritarian leader, and which is really quite frightening. And then you have permissive parenting, where the kids, you treat the kid like an adult, and you sort of give them anything they want, and you sort of negotiate with them, and let them have their own way. And what happens in those cases is the kids realize they think they can just walk all over people. Okay? So that creates problems when they get older. And they also don't learn to tolerate anxiety, because as soon as they get anxious, the parents come in. And you heard about these helicopter parents, right? And I'm a little guilty of this. I hate to say it, I'm a little guilty of this. Especially when you have an only child, it's really easy to be a helicopter parent. You have 2 or 3 kids, you don't have enough time to, just to focus, on everything going on with one. But the kids don't learn to tolerate anxiety, and that's important. It's important to learn to tolerate anxiety. Okay. So parenting styles are very interesting. You'll run across that again here, not just in this class, but in other classes here on campus. You're going to hear more about the parenting styles. Okay, philosophy, art. So the idea that this is scientific activity, what she's doing, but it's not scientific activity in the sense of scientism, in this narrow definition of what science is. But if you take a broader definition, most of the clinicians fall into a more broader definition of science. More like science, how it was done back in the day of Francis Bacon, where you take lots of observations and then you draw conclusions from that, as opposed to rigorously testing hypotheses. Okay, so it's scientific in the sense of drawing conclusions from observations. It's not scientific in the sense of testing hypotheses, formally testing hypotheses. There's other theories, a lot of deep philosophy. Again, when you think about this coming from Freud, there's a lot of philosophy behind this, a lot of philosophical kind of thinking. And again, I think for the sake of this class, that's okay.